Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 179.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, what I might probably have is some building noise going on in the background. So I apologise if that's the case. It's around about that time of day when the builders might be going home, but they have been hammering next door. So if that's the case, I apologise. Not much I can do about it.
No problem.
Can't complain. It's too early in the day. Okay, what do I have for you? I have a couple of books. Not in their entirety, obviously. It's too much to detail 2 books. And I suppose I did think about it afterwards. I could have tried to go and find a podcast about them. But there were a couple of books that I read, both of them in the space of about a week. And I think they're pretty important books. So I really wanted to share them with you. I think they'd be of interest to you personally and hopefully to some people at home as well. Now, the first one is called The Good Ally by Nova Reid, and it was published in 2021, so not too long ago. And she says, she's quite good in her introduction. She sort of lays out who this book is for, and this book is very much, she says, written for white people. And she goes on to detail that a little bit more. She says, white people racialized as white, perceived as white. So she sort of, widens that category out a little bit. And she says she's very much centering blackness. And it's told through a black British lens, which is what she is. That's her perspective. And I think it's really useful and relevant, though, for all white people, wherever they are. So I think people in America, Australia, wherever, you're all going to benefit from reading this. There were plenty of references, particularly to some things in the States. It wasn't too Brit specific to make it that niche. As I said at the beginning, it's way too much in the book to try and cover it here. So it's really more about my overall feelings and impressions. Having said that, I've still managed to write quite a few notes. But to me, it feels like a real gift of a book that comes from an amazing generosity on the part of Nova Reid, the author. It felt like, to me anyway, that she would be perfectly justified to be slapping me around the face with some of the messages that she had to convey, but she really doesn't do that. Instead, it feels like she really takes you by the hand and guides you through and never really letting go of that connection. It's difficult to explain, but if you listen to it as I did, and she narrates it, so it really is her speaking to you. Like I say, it's hard to explain, but she keeps a connection. She talks to you and she tells you things. There are times when she tells you, take a moment. That was pretty hard to hear, wasn't it? Take a moment. Breathe. Go take a break if you need to. So you really feel like she's talking to you from that sort of perspective. It feels like a very reassuring parent. She's educating you, but while she's doing that, she's holding you in this really empathic space so that you, as a child, and I really felt this, you could really stamp your feet and sulk a bit. So, she allows you to do that. She acknowledges it and she asks you to acknowledge it. So when she said, yeah, if you're feeling uncomfortable, that's good. But again, take a breath, go take a break if you need to. So it's really, when I felt with the kind of messages from her position, her perspective, she would be quite justified in really slapping me about the face with it. You just, you listen to this, you need to listen to this, and, really jump up and down. But she really doesn't.
It's one of those times when it's a good thing that you're not totally proficient in the Jim Quick speed reading, because
yeah.
I think if you were holding that book and reading it, you would fly right past those things
that's a very good
really point. Let you absorb and hear her.
Yes, and I think it's one of those books that's important to hear it in her voice. I really felt that. And I think you'd miss something if you read it rather than listening to it, actually. Just a few notes about the actual book, just to give you an idea of some of the things that she talks to you about. I mean, it's pretty obvious, really. She's talking about anti-racism work, but she outlines what she sees as the 4 key stages of anti-racism work. Number 1, listening. Number 2, unlearning. Number 3, relearning. And number 4, responsive action. And she talks about curiosity. She says it's your superpower. Self-inquiry, she says, is important. Discomfort is inevitable, but really important. So lean into it. Unlearning racism that has been normalized is probably going to make you feel quite uncomfortable and might make you want to disengage. She talks a lot about different terms and how they can hold us back, not least of all racism itself. She says most of us, or a lot of people, think of racism as a conscious, intentional, overt act. Very often we at least feel like it's tied to identity. And so, if you exhibit racist behaviour, that automatically makes you a bad person. But she says the problem with this is it just serves to shut down the conversation. And then that denies that there's a problem. And I remember this was a huge moment for me, when you have these sort of seismic shifts. And that was when I accepted that as a white person, I am always going to be racist. And still makes me feel a bit sick saying that, but I'm able to say it, and I'm going to say it because I see it as a fact. But once I got used to that, once I got used to saying that to myself, once I got used to accepting it, once I got used to the fact that it doesn't have to be a conscious, intentional, overt act, it's not tied to your identity, it doesn't make you necessarily a bad person. Once I managed to sort of pull that apart a bit, then you can start unlearning stuff and being aware of things that are going on around you. Like she was saying, if you hold it as this big spectre of a thing, you can't ever accept that you can say things, think things, do things that are racist, however unintentional. You can't do any of that without and still be a good person. And so you just shut it down and you don't think about it, and you're not aware of it in yourself, and you can't be aware of it in others. And then how can you ever possibly act against it? So she says, you can be unconsciously racist, you can be unintentionally racist, and you can still be a good person. It is possible. At the very least, you benefit from systemic racism and the societal advantages given to you as a white person. You can't get away from that. And talks a bit about white privilege. Talks quite a lot about white privilege, actually. But really interesting that this is just I'm just pulling a few things out of the book here. But apparently originally in the 1960s, the term was white skin privilege. And she talks a little bit about the difference in the nuance there. And this is where it feels like going back to that parental role. She's going to educate you. It's going to be a little bit difficult, but I'm going to hold your hand. She says, white privilege is the sort of little bit, although a lot of people have trouble with that term, it's a little bit nicey term, but white privilege is the inescapable consequence of the construct of white supremacy. And I think that was one of those moments. Take a moment. We have to talk about white supremacy and systemic advantage. And again, this is a term that is so much less palatable, but one that needs to be confronted. And talks a lot about microaggressions and their devastating impact. She talks about how multiple small acts actually hit a lot harder than one overt act and has the same impact on the body as war veterans experience PTSD. This is a traumatic response. She's got a good TED talk about that, and I'll put the link in the show notes. I'll put a couple of other links if I can find them, as well as the book itself. And she talks a lot about shame versus guilt. And of course, that made me think of Brené Brown and the trouble with shame. And she talks often throughout the book about going into shame spirals. And the problem with that is that you just shut down. You can't listen when you're in shame. And, we've talked about this, haven't we, with Brené Brown. Whereas guilt can inspire action. And I think that was the shift that I had with accepting the racism as being a part of me. I went from feeling shame to feeling guilt. With guilt can encourage curiosity, can encourage action, encourages you to want to do something about it. You can carry the guilt and you can action that. Whereas shame, you curl in on yourself and you can't do anything about it.
Yeah, exactly what you just described. I was picturing it as you were talking. I think guilt is one of those things you can see you're squirming and you want to resolve it.
Yes.
You want to improve. You want to do better. You want to learn. Whereas shame, you want to hide. You want to curl up in your turtle shell and not be seen and not be noticed. And that then also, I think, leads to defensive-ness, denial. So definitely those two responses are very different.
Yeah. I really think that. And it's a real workbook. She offers practical advice on how to work through some of these issues, how to address things when they come up. There's some awful examples that are quite shocking, but she breaks them down and shows how they could be used to educate and help children especially. But she actually gives you some examples, so when they said this is what commonly would happen as a response, I'm going to give you an alternative. Maybe this is what you do, because the chances are this is going to happen to you, especially as a parent, different things. So yes, really, really helpful book. Just one other thing that I pulled out in my notes here was when she was talking about equality. And she was saying equality is not the immediate goal in anti-racism. Intentional equity is. Equity means directly addressing the systemic disadvantages present that can cause more groups to experience social disadvantage than others. Giving everyone the same does not mean we are all suddenly equal or inequality fails to exist. And she goes through a long example about it, someone else's example actually, but giving everyone a £5. But so much is dependent on the context and all sorts of things. Go listen to it yourself. It's really, but it was something that stuck out to me. When someone tells you something, oh God, yeah, that's so obvious, yet it's not obvious. We all talk about equality, but it's not equality that's important, it's intentional equity. And there is quite a big difference, but it's not immediately obvious. So that's my first book. And like I say, there's so much more to it. I've just picked out a few things to give you a taster there, but I think it's a really important book.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That sounds like a definite listen to for me. Hopefully other people might even pick it up and read it, but definitely something I know I want to look at more deeply.
And the second book, which I think came up as a recommendation, actually I know exactly where it came up. She being Nova Reid, mentioned and quoted from, I think, this book or this author's work a few times. And so I thought, oh, well, that might be interesting. So I went up and looked up the book and thought, yes, that does sound interesting. I'm going to listen to that next. And that book is Diversify by June Sarpong. Both British authors, but June Sarpong particularly says that this book is written from a UK and US perspective, and it focuses quite a lot on Brexit and Trump, two things that were going on round about the same time, and it came out in 2017. So I thought it would be, after reading it, it would be really interesting actually, because some of the things she talks about, a lot's happened in the interim. I mean, what's that? That's 5-6 years. Quite a lot has happened in that time. I would really like a sort of an update to some of the things she was speculating about. But so this, although it came up, recommended in a book about race. This is a little, but not really. It's about diversity, as the title gives the game away, really. But the subheading of it is 6 degrees of integration. And she talks about this 6 degrees of integration rather than separation. And we all know about Kevin Bacon's 6 degrees of separation, don't we? But she says that these 6 degrees of separation show how we are all linked, but are we connected? And this is what she's getting at with her book. And so talks about the 6 degrees of integration, not separation. Because she says that most of us tend to really stay predominantly in that 1 degree of separation. And so she has 6 degrees of integration, 6 steps or shifts. And those are: challenge your isms. And she has a little test. You can test what isms you have. Check your circle. Connect with others. Change your mind. Celebrate difference. And champion the cause. And she talks about others and otherisms. And the book is structured into chapters of others. And other, she specifies as a demographic excluded socially, politically, or economically because of their difference from the dominant group or groups in society. And she says, basically, if you are not a white, non-disabled, educated, heterosexual, middle-aged, middle or upper-class male adhering to a version of Christianity or atheism that fits within the confines of a secular liberal democracy, then, on some level, you will have been made to feel like an other. So you can see there's quite a wide range of others she's talking about. Just very briefly, those are the other man, and that she splits up into black, Muslim, and white working class. The latter in particular is a very large, and she talks about influential, especially when it comes to voting, as a pretty large and influential group. Women, class, body, so she goes into talking about different disabilities, sex, she talks about different LGBTQ things, age, young and old, and the disproportionate value that is given to people of working age, view, as in political view, and then she ends up with way in action, so what to do about it. There was one particular thing that I pulled out as a note, which I thought was quite interesting, and we'll all be very familiar with this, and this is a term called splitting. And this is where we tend to, when confronted with something, just have really extreme polarized views. And we see that all around us. And she's saying a really good example of this is cancel culture. And she says we really need to have more conversations, more integration, and more diversification of our own spheres. That's it, really, just a taste of her book. But her book overall is talking about the need for diversification, but not just from a moral point of view. She says from a moral, social, and perhaps most importantly, because that's what gets a lot of people, from an economic point of view. And so throughout the book, she talks about these different perspectives. The moral perspective, for most people listening, a lot of these things are quite obvious from a moral perspective. Social perspective, probably fairly too. But economically, that, I think that was the bit that potentially was more challenging, certainly to certain groups of society. But she puts forward great arguments for the fact, and she actually puts a figure at the end, the cost of not diversifying, and that we would all be better off morally, socially, and most definitely economically if we lived in a more diverse society. So it was sort of carrying along in the same theme a little bit, but much broader. And another really important thing, I think, to think about. So yes, so those are my 2 books. And I did mention that the first one was a workbook, and she does have some different journaling ideas. as she goes through. And as you know, most of the time I'm listening when I'm out on dog walks and things. So I made the decision early on for my first pass of the book just to listen to it, let it wash over me, and then go back in and listen to it again, and doing some of that journaling. I got so much from that first pass, just from an overall. And yes, top tip, maybe don't listen to the epilogue when you're in public, unless you don't mind people seeing tears streaming down your face in public. Very moving end to the book. There was a big section actually on the danger of performance, allyship, and me, I'm a great overthinker, so part of me was a little bit concerned about that with bringing it to you. Is it, am I getting into that territory? But basically I came down to the point of view that I'd be very grateful if somebody had shared this book with me, and so I think it was very worth sharing and risking that there might be an element of that, and I think the more people who read it, the better. So that was that was another motivation for sharing.
Yeah. So I already downloaded the first one. I'll have to look into the second one, but I've already got that queued up and ready. Very excited about this, Daisy. And I really appreciate your vulnerability in sharing this too. I know these are topics that it's easier to ignore or avoid or side skirt. And so I always appreciate your willingness to hit them head on. So thank you for that. And I hope everyone digs into this at whatever level they're able to at this point, because I think it will help all of us.
Yes, and I do recommend it wherever you are in your journey. She does sort of say at the beginning, unless you're, past the beginner stage, this might be too much. But go back to what I said about it feeling like a parent holding your hand. So I think, if you've got any interest in digging into this, you will feel quite nurtured, held to account. Like I say, that good balance of a parent, when they're sort of telling you off about something, but they're doing it in a way that feels like you're going to benefit from it in the long run.
Very good.
And they let you stamp your feet a bit if you need to.
That's right.
Okay, well, until we meet again, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.